Greetings and welcome to the second lecture on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible by Eugen Drewermann, who is the internationally acclaimed author of more than 100 books that interpret biblical stories, fairy tales, and classics of world literature in ways that we today can apply it to ourselves and find answers to some of the most pressing questions of ourselves and of our times. In our first lecture, I laid the groundwork and shared with you that Drewermann begins his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, that was a very well received book in Germany and in many other languages, with drawing a background of what we as human beings need redemption from. The word redemption is almost a outdated word. It has a very kind of religious ring to it. But what Drewermann tries to do is to show how these texts in the Gospel of Mark are trying to respond to deep experiences that we as humans have of despair, of misery, of distress, that we are looking for redemption from. And Drewermann tries to interpret these stories in such a way that we can connect what's happening in the stories to our own experience and gain help from it. Move from despair to hope, from hopelessness to the sense that there is something on the horizon. I had shared with you how Drewermann first talked about the story of the so-called fall in Genesis 3, which he sees as kind of a backdrop for the experience world that the Gospel of Mark also talks about. And what I had emphasized in my first lecture was that Drewermann corrects the harmful, moralistic misinterpretation and reduction of this story to questions of obedience and disobedience, and tries to understand and help us understand that this story is actually a story of how we lose ground under our feet, how we fall into the abyss when we're faced with death, when we're faced with uncertainty. And so Drewermann listens very carefully to what's in the story. And one of the things that he pointed out is that in the story, the character of the woman, and the woman here stands for humans in general, is trying to defend God against the voice of the serpent. And the serpent, Drewermann argues, has to be understood symbolically as something, as a voice that comes up in us when we are becoming aware of ourselves in a certain way. The voice of the serpent causes anxiety, and Drewermann associated it with our experience of our contingency, with our nothingness. And this experience makes us try to hold on to anything in the world so that we don't feel despair. And that what is often depicted in art, the taking of the fruit, is actually just a consequence of the experience of despair and trying to find a way to stop up that despair, in this case with food from the tree. I had also explained that Drewermann corrects the misinterpretation of the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil is often understood as humans learning to know what is morally good or evil. But Drewermann, connecting with the story and with the text in Genesis 2, where God says it is not good for humans to be alone, points out that this goodness is not about doing something good or bad morally, but that it is about how we feel in the world, whether we feel in the world that the world is good, whether we are good as we are or not. And that the story in Genesis 3 contrasts with the story in Genesis 2, where in Genesis 2, the last verse says that humans were naked and not ashamed of themselves. But then the result of the voice of the serpent and the anxiety that comes up there, and then the taking of the fruit, makes humans become aware of themselves as naked in a way that makes them ashamed of themselves. So that is the knowledge of good and evil, that we now see our nakedness, our limitations, our contingency, and that we think and believe and feel that we are bad, that life is bad, that the limitations of life make life bad. Now, in the introduction in the Gospel of Mark, Drewermann summarizes the analysis of this story, which he had first developed in his dissertation and habilitation, 3 volumes that he has. This is the volume, The Yahwist Primordial History in Exegetical Perspective. And there are the other 2 volumes that I'd like to show you today. The second volume is in psychoanalytic perspective, and the third volume is in philosophical perspective. And I can show you a picture of Drewermann at the time when he wrote these 3 volumes. This was between well, he really wrote it before the publication, obviously, but they were published in 1977 and 1978 by the publisher Schöning. So Drewermann takes this portrayal of what really bothers us most fundamentally as human beings as the starting point, and shows how the Gospel of Mark has a very similar perspective on what ails us as human beings. And so today I would like to continue with the introduction of the Gospel of Mark. And just as a reminder again for anyone who might see a lecture for the first time, that these lectures are intended to help produce translations of Drewermann's works. And so the first one that I'm starting with right now is the commentary on the Gospel of Mark, which is this first volume, and the subtitle is Images of Redemption. And we had last time actually stopped with a reference to the Cain and Abel story, and how when we have lost sight of our own footing, that then we create anxiety for each other, and we spread the fear of death that we ourselves experiencing and that we can't calm by instilling fear in others and threatening others to kill them, whether physically or symbolically, and that the Cain and Abel story portrays that. Cain and Abel, just to briefly mention this, are both vying for the blessing of the divine, and Cain is feeling that God is preferring Abel, the youngest. And then Drewermann points out that God actually speaks with Cain and encourages Cain to go to Abel and talk it out with him. And so Cain, with the best intentions, meets Abel on the field, and as they're trying with their best intentions to resolve this conflict that really at heart is an existential conflict, Cain is no longer able to use his will and stuff down the resentment he has, and instead, against his own will, kills Abel. And from there, the God image gets further characterized by ambivalence, which is, from Drewermann's perspective, a result of the original fall into fear and despair that is described in Genesis 3. And then the rest of the chapters of the so-called Yahweh's primordial history in Genesis 2 through 11, and it's called Yahweh's because there's the assumption that there was a writer that used the word Yahweh for God, whereas two other writers didn't use Yahweh, instead used Elohim. And so that's why it's called the Yahweh's primordial history. But that the spiral of anxiety and despair keeps increasing as humans strive through their own efforts to calm their fears, calm their despair. And it goes all the way to the Tower of Babel, where it looks like as if we are having a society in which everyone understands everyone. And as I was reading that recently, I was thinking of the fantasy that is currently being created by technology companies of a metaverse. And I think there is a dynamic like this going on. There is this metaverse that is being thrown around as sort of as if the digital universe that we will create, that we all will on some level participate in digitally, in virtual reality, that will solve our problems. This is a very apropos example of what the story of the Tower of Babel is. Because even if we create a metaverse, we will not get rid of our fundamental human anxieties and of our fundamental human conflicts that stem from them, as long as they are not calmed by a much deeper source. And that is what the Gospel of Mark talks about. That is how the Gospel of Mark describes Jesus as a person who actually addresses this deeper level that we are looking for healing at. and liberation. So I will go now into this second part of the introduction of the Gospel of Mark. And what's very interesting about this is that Drewermann takes on the whole question of in which sense the gospel writer speaking of Satan is meant. So Drewermann tries to help us understand what the language of Satan means for us today. And another cultural allusion here, as I'm reading this, you may think actually of the very popular show Lucifer that has been on Netflix, because in that show, Lucifer, the Satan, the son of one of the angels of God, or one of the sons of God, is portrayed in ways that actually are resembling to some of what Drewermann is talking about here, that has to do with this attempt to be more perfect than God. So let us take a look at this. And as we go into this second part of the introduction to the Gospel of Mark, and Drewermann wrote a fairly substantial introduction there that has been published in some languages actually as a book by itself, which may be a way to do it in English at first as well. But some of the questions that we're going to see addressed here by Drewermann is how to understand this religious language, how to understand the talk of hell, the talk of the devil, the talk of redemption, and of evil spirits in ways that don't demonize us as human beings and that also don't demonize God. So let's get into this. The main heading for that second part is called Redemption through the Death of the Son of God, or the Mystery of God's Reign. Now, the redemption through the death of the Son of God, the idea that humans are redeemed through the Son of God, which is one of the dogmatic phrases that Christianity has, will be dealt with in next week's lecture. In the first part of this second section in the introduction, however, Drewermann deals with this subheading: the battle between Satan and God, or the importance of depth psychology for comprehending religious reality. So he's trying to make a case here for why we need to think psychologically in order to understand religion in the first place. So let me read some parts here. I will skip some parts, I will summarize some parts so that we can get through this in a timely fashion. Here's how he begins this second part. Anyone who enters the world of the Gospel of Mark finds themselves, and I will use themselves, sometimes I will use he or she sometimes, and sometimes I will use he or she or they to just indicate inclusiveness in the translation here. So anyone who enters the world of the Gospel of Mark finds themselves, without noticing it at first, in an uncanny, frightening, strange, mystic, demonic world, which is profoundly shaped, as in the Yahvistic primordial history, by the mystery of evil, which Mark now, however, sees personified in the devil. What is meant by this cipher, meaning the devil? We already must ask what the tempting serpent in the Yahvistic primordial history represents. Why did God create it if it brings nothing but misery to humans? We cannot understand the meaning of the symbol of the serpent if we reify it historically or fixate it dogmatically. Reify is a term that basically means that we take a term and think of it as a thing. That's basically what reifying means. Just because we call something this, we think that means it exists in kind of a substance way or in a fixed way. The serpent as a primordial danger of every human being is neither a representation of the fertility cult of Canaan or Egypt, nor is it the devil of Persian and ancient Jewish apocalypticism, which we could be thinking of it this way historically because the motif may come from there historically. But for the Yahvist, this is, and also for Mark, this is not what it actually means. I continue with the reading. It is a matter of fact, surprising to Christian ears in quotation marks here actually, that in the Yahvistic primordial history, the power of evil must be understood as a part of the world created by God, which is said in Genesis 3, verse 1. While it is nonetheless the guilt of humans that the serpent is able to work its art of seduction with insurmountable cunning in the heart of every human being. However, this extraordinary important ambivalent appearance is inherent in the symbol of the snake. So Drewermann is asking us now to pay attention to this, why the snake is a symbol. No matter on which level of interpretation we read the image of the serpent, whether nature mythologically, depth psychologically, or philosophically, the serpent always embodies the space of transition between water and land, cave and earth, night and day, darkness and light, impulse and consciousness, sexuality and culture. As an image of phallic potency or female originality, it symbolizes not only psychically the sphere of the chthonic, unconscious, sublunary, and still undifferentiated, from which all forms arise. We can see in the symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent that curls itself together into a circle between mouth and tail, also a metaphysical symbol for the entire material world in its eternal cycle of emergence and decay, birth and death, blossoming and withering, like in the serpent shape of the Egyptian god Atum. And just as a side note here, Ouroboros is also the term for the infinity sign, which will become significant later. From this perspective, it makes sense that the serpent belongs essentially to creation, or that it embodies the created world itself. So just the infinity sign, or that there's this never-ending cycle of life and death. That's what I want to emphasize here at this point. Yet it would be an error with grave consequences, and one that would be diametrically in contrast to the biblical image of God if we thought the nature of evil would lie in materiality itself, in the sense of Gnostic speculation. Gnosticism thought that the material world itself is something evil. And so Drewermann is saying that this is not really what the Bible means. So we shouldn't confuse it with this view that materiality itself is evil, as in Gnosticism. Decisive for the meaning of the Yahvistic story of the fall is rather the fact that as soon as humans become aware of, that is, as soon as the serpent speaks to them, the principle of the transience, the contingency of everything that is created, which is what the serpent represents, then an anxiety emerges that progressively makes all of existence seem evil and drives even the best efforts of humans into misery. It is not the serpent which God created that is evil. That people lose sight of God in their anxiety, meaning of their absolute grounding of, as I will clarify in other places, and Drewermann clarifies, and actually here also, as the belief in a person who wills us to exist, who wants us absolutely to exist in the face of this contingency. But I'm getting ahead of myself and also of Drewermann here. But I think for a lecture like this on video, it's important to fill some of this stuff in beforehand so that we kind of keep in mind where we're heading. That people lose sight of God in their anxiety and that they eventually set themselves up to be substitute gods, that determines the guilt for missing their own existence. They cannot escape this guilt through their own means. Rather, humans wriggle in a net of anxiety, similar to how an animal caught in a snare tightens the deadly wire hook around its neck ever more through its desperate twitches from choking. The Gospel of Mark fully adopts this image of an extreme hopelessness as well, just like the Yahwist primordial history. And primordial means something that's really before time, or that is at the beginning of time. Drewermann argues that in his 3-volume Structures of Evil, which also needs to be translated, he argues that when we hear in the first lines of the Bible, in the beginning, that this is not about a temporal statement, but that this is how we are at first, all of us, that it is actually a statement about the nature of who we are, not a statement about a beginning in the past. And he takes that from the Hebrew sense of time, actually. This is very important to emphasize because we often think of the story of Genesis 2 and 3 as if it is something that happened long time ago, like 10,000, 15,000 years ago, in some theological and religious circles. And it leads to all kinds of speculations and led to the speculations that influenced theology quite a bit, as if because of this one act, very much in the beginning of history, we today are all fallen. So you can see how the significance of really understanding that this is not about a temporal beginning, but rather about something at the heart of who we are as human beings when we are falling into this anxiety. So let me continue. For Mark too, this world is completely at the mercy of the power of evil, which has built a closed system of domination in the hearts of humans. The only difference is that Mark no longer speaks of the origin of evil by means of a symbolic image such as the serpent. Instead, he adopts from ancient Jewish apocalypticism the idea of Satan and his subservient demons. That is, spiritual forces which, as persons, hold this world and humans captive and keep them away from God. This devil is for Mark so much the actual prince of this world that the kingdom of God first has to fight for its place on earth in order to reach humans. Salvation, when it comes, can therefore only come as if from outside, from the sphere of God to humans. And the one who embodies and brings it can at first appear only like an intruder, like a troublemaker and destroyer. He must inevitably endanger and bring down an order in which people have long since ceased to subjectively feel and reflect on how much anxiety, despair, and anguish is frozen in it, and how much anxiety, despair, and anguish it therefore necessarily spreads time and again. Precisely because of this humanity, and Drewermann puts here in parenthesis, as the, quote, Son of Man, unquote, and I will translate Son of Man here as Son of Humanity, because while Son of Man is a technical term that comes from actually Jewish apocalypticism, appears in the book of Daniel and also in the book of, in the Gospel of Mark, where Mark actually basically references Daniel. I will translate it in the spirit, in the way Drewermann talks about this, as representing Jesus as a representative of a humanity that basically is healed, that is not reduced to anxiety. That's what humanity is meant to be. So in that sense, Son of Humanity, or that's what Son of Man stands for. So precisely because of his humanity, the exact opposite is condensed in the person of Jesus than what naturally dominates the laws of life of everyone. It is a life and death struggle that the man from Nazareth faces from the very beginning. Now, anyone who reads this Gospel of Mark can therefore not avoid entering into this tension and examining narrative after narrative, word by word, as we will do, in relation to the person of Jesus, to discern to what extent her or his own life is shaped by the forces of construction or destruction, of salvation or misery. So this is a very important point. Here Drewermann says for the first time that we can only understand the Gospel of Mark if we ourselves enter into this tension in our own lives of construction and destruction, in our own lives of contingency and hope. Without that, we cannot really make sense of it. So this is an invitation, as we are going through these lectures, to apply this to ourselves. If someone does not realize how deadly their own life, seen through the eyes of Jesus, appears, they will also not be able to understand what causes the most profound suffering in the Gospel of Mark, and what sense it makes from God's perspective of these questions, of the following questions. why the public ministry of Jesus leads with such inevitability into death, and why it seems that we always begin to live only after we have killed what lets us live, which is a reference to Jesus being killed. And so this is a reference already to the death of the Son of God, or the Son of Man as well. So why we emerge only after the darkening of the sun at Golgotha from non-life of from the non-life of our existence to mature toward the Easter morning of a new sunrise. So here Drewermann makes allusions to the symbolism of death and resurrection and Easter. It does not help to avoid the personal challenge of this absolute opposition between God and the devil, life and death, heaven and hell, faith and despair in Mark's gospel, by simply parroting the language of the Bible in the exegetical literature without interpreting and explaining the reality this language talks about. For example, by stating factually very correctly, but in existentially completely irrelevant fashion. And Drewermann here provides a quote from a exegete that has written a book on the Gospel of Mark. This is, let me go to this. It is Rudolf Pech, the Gospel of Mark, but I will not quote this now for the sake of time. What he's basically saying is that it's not enough if we just repeat the phrases and then learn to understand a little bit about how these phrases historically developed, how sort of do a conceptual history, and then think because we have done a conceptual history and now we just have to believe that these concepts correspond to a reality, a spiritual reality or whatever. That is not enough. Now, fortunately, since Drewermann has written this commentary, the first one was in 1987, the volume, there have been developments in exegesis that have gone beyond this, especially under the pressure from liberationist forms of exegesis. But a lot of the exegetical day-to-day work still is dealing a lot with conceptual stuff, and Drewermann points out that, for instance, in his conflict with the Catholic Church hierarchy, and he sometimes references Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger or the now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who does actually this kind of what Drewermann at times calls conceptual fetishism, where the concepts are reified, there's that word again, and where repeating biblical language is seen as if that is a sign of faith, or if that language made itself obviously into dogmas, if repeating those dogmas as if these are the tests of faith. Drewermann argues that that does nothing to understand what these texts are about. It does nothing to help us understand what experiences are expressed through these terms. And so there we have to go into experiences that are described in these terms. But how do we get to experiences like that? How would we know what kind of experiences these are? And this is where Drewermann will introduce some methodological points in this section that we're actually going through right now. So let's listen for that. So we need to ask much more fundamentally, How does a person experience themselves who perceives the world in such a disjointed way? How do they feel about themselves when their whole life appears to them as an outrageous battlefield, as a terrain of an incessant battle of spirits that can only truly come to an end in the person of Jesus? If we want to recover the experiential dimension of the realities of which the gospel actually gives testimony, then this is already the point at which depth psychology becomes quite indispensable for understanding the basic theological conception of the Gospel of Mark as a story of redemption. To say the following about, he quotes again some exegete talking about unclean spirits, and again in a way that basically does conceptual history and doesn't really go beyond this. Drewermann comments on this. These kinds of statements can never reach the place where it would be possible to feel oneself into the reality of such descriptions and to comprehend for one's own existence what is actually at stake here if we really were to talk of, and the author had referenced repression and self-alienation. So if we were to talk of repression psychologically and self-alienation, daseinsanalytically, and here he introduces a term, daseinsanalysis. It comes from Dasein, which is made up of da, which is there, and sein, which is being. It's a German word, Dasein. It looms large in existential philosophy, especially in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. There were some psychiatrists and therapists, psychologists that were not satisfied with psychoanalysis and thought that psychoanalysis doesn't really address the existential dimension. And they created Daseinsanalysis to address existential questions, basically. And so Dasein is translated as existence. There is a famous book that was edited by Rollo May here in the United States called Existence, that is a collection of really some of the Dasein's analytic writings today that in the United States is subsumed under existential psychotherapy. But I will refer here to the term Daseinsanalysis because Drewermann actually does integrate the psychoanalytic and the existential, the Dasein's perspective in a very creative and new way that takes its departure not really from Heidegger so much, but rather from Kierkegaard. Even though he does quote the Daseinsanalysts, Medard Boss, Ludwig Binswanger, John Gondrow, and so on. But that's just to explain this term. So the problem of historical critical exegesis is here as elsewhere the same at every turn. We can never penetrate to the level of reality that is religiously relevant by means of historical research and objectifying description. For this level does not lie in something past, meaning the level of reality that's religiously relevant, but rather directly in the people of all times and zones. So the religiously relevant level lies in us as humans. And until this level has not been understood and kept open as a constant point of reference, can the enduring truth and validity that lies in historical texts which bear witness to religious experiences, also not become visible. In order to understand what the Gospel of Mark means when it speaks of a world of spirits that set up a counter realm to the realm of God, in order to beset people or to afflict people with disease, evil, untruth, and lies, to the point of a hardening of hearts, we must first learn from peoples and cultures that still live in a worldview akin to the Bible. And here Drewermann makes an argument for the relevance of anthropology and ethnology, which can help us understand how certain motifs of death and resurrection, of virgin birth, as we touched on last time, of miracles and so on, religious miracles, how these kinds of stories first come about. And he makes an argument that we should learn from cultures that are still living similarly in a pre-enlightenment kind of way, and learn from them. Now, Drewermann says the ethnology of the last decades, using the richness of its experiences as well as the aid of structural interpretations of myth. Here he makes the case for appreciating structuralism, a philosophical method. So the aid of structural interpretations and of myth and cultural descriptions has been able to demonstrate, so ethnology has been able to demonstrate that our seemingly very different rational thinking is not differently organized than the thinking of those whom we so often have despised as so-called savages, in quotation marks, because they live still before the turn of the Enlightenment. So Drewermann critiques here this snobbish Western thinking, in which we think that our reason has progressed so much. He argues, no, as humans, we're all having the same structures. But even with this ethnologically important new approach, nothing really decisive has yet been gained, he then says. For even though the structure of thought may be common to all people, the contents of thoughts are so different between cultures that it is still very difficult to understand and communicate with each other across cultural boundaries. However, here he comes to somewhat of a solution. An immediate similarity between peoples of all times and zones exists in the deep layers of the human psyche, in the strong passions, longings, dreams, feelings, and needs. Herein lies a common source of humanity, to which religion, too, owes its origin. It is thus paramount when reading religious texts of unknown cultures and past times, including the New Testament, to become aware of the psychic origins of experience, whose reality are conjured up and interpreted in each of the traditions. They're not to be understood, first of all, as literature, but as expressions of life and experience in which we today are capable and invited to participate. One may not take the ashes for more important than the fire. Remember my pointing out Drewermann's metaphor of the text as embers, to whom we ourselves need to bring the fire of our own existence in order to shed light on what they actually mean. This is a reference to that. From this point of view, the religious question in interpreting the belief in spirits in the Gospel of Mark, which is central to the understanding of redemption through Christ, cannot be the following. In that way, cannot be the following. In what way did the Greco-Roman, the ancient Near Eastern, or the ancient Jewish world believe in demons and spirits? Rather, assuming one is historically sufficiently informed about the matter, so he argues we need to do historical criticism, of course, first, but then, rather, the real endeavor for a religious understanding begins only when we become aware in ourselves and in others of the experience of mental states in which the world seems precisely as contradictory and divided as described in the Gospel of Mark. The actual task and invaluable service depth psychology has to offer to an understanding of religious texts lies precisely in this task. And Drewermann clarifies in parentheses here that this is not to be confused with subjectification or the psychologization of the divine, of God. So this is the task. Depth psychology's knowledge of human anxiety, fragmentation, and distress has an enormous experiential advantage over the so-called care of the soul, or we could also translate as pastoral care. And building on this, a far more differentiated level of analytic reflection than theology, meaning analytic reflection on the experiences. Through this, because depth psychology is attuned to internal subjective experience, it's attuned to mental experiences, psychological experiences. And that is the shape also of what is being dealt with in the stories, Drewermann argues. So through this level, I continue reading, of reflection, the numerous central statements of any religion of redemption, and of Christianity in particular, can first of all be again understood and experienced as something in ourselves. When it comes to the question of evil in humans, psychoanalysis shows that the belief, quote, belief in spirits in the Gospel of Mark is nothing exotic or historically foreign. On the contrary, it exists latently in the heart of every human being and emerges immediately in the form of psychotic experience as soon as the inner reality, the morally coerced splitting, and the ignorance of large parts of one's psyche exceed a certain amount. But even way before one reaches the psychotic level, already within the framework of what is generally called normal, there is so much in ourselves neurotoid, which is a term he gets from neo-psychoanalysis, a form of psychoanalysis that also pointed out that there are character dynamics that are close to being healthy. That's what neurotoid partly, I think, means. And neurotic, that one can claim without reservation that it is merely a question of honesty and psychological perceptiveness, to which extent someone finds the scenario that the Gospel of Mark draws of the life of every human being confirmed in their own experience. A world that is divided into a vast number of uncontrollably conflicting forces, which are only waiting to be admitted to life, but which in the field of anxiety, in the state of repression and of splitting off of consciousness, lead to an uncanny life of their own in a subterranean realm of spirits. So that is the kind of experience reality What the Yavistic primordial history portrays in images handed down in the myth of peoples everywhere as a development of humanity's attitude towards life and of the consciousness of each individual person among the so-called banished children of Eve is from a depth psychological perspective naturally described in the Gospel of Mark by means of the apocalyptic images of ancient Judaism as the starting point. And so with these archetypal images of ancient Judaism, the Gospel of Mark describes a world in which, under the omnipotent dictates of anxiety, no one can be what they are or do what they want to do. Each person is carefully on guard against themselves and on the run from everyone else. The best powers of one's intellect are used to control, censor, cut off, and dissociate from oneself, until finally the negation of one's own self under the cover of the familiar and confidence-inspiring names of duty, obedience, will of God, law, necessity, community, church, state, society, etc., has been internalized so thoroughly that one eventually believes one can be oneself only in blatant contradiction to oneself. 150 years ago, Søren Kierkegaard defined despair as the state when people always want to be what they are not and do not want to be what they are. Kierkegaard described that in The Sickness Unto Death. Drewermann calls this an ingeniously coined definition. If we take this definition as the basis for our understanding, then the people in the Gospel of Mark who are dominated by the constrictions of their soul and the split-offs in their psyche must be considered daseinsanalytically as people in despair, in deep despair, as psychoneurotics out of necessity, as prisoners of a meshwork of anxiety which transforms what was originally most trusted, one's own soul, into an internal terrain, into a territory occupied by foreign powers, into a counter-realm to what was actually intended by God. One may object, not exegetically, but perhaps dogmatically, that it is not acceptable to consider the figure of the devil So one may object, not exegetically, but perhaps dogmatically, that it is not acceptable to consider the figure of the devil purely psychologically. But the point is not at all psychological reductions. The point is to truly understand, first of all, the experiences which get connected everywhere on earth with the idea of evil spirits. We must first live through and suffer through the amount of adversity and suffering and the psychosomatic illnesses and psychoneurotic symptoms that must arise from impulses of the human psyche when they have been suppressed by anxiety. Only then will we understand, particularly in contrast to this anxiety, why only a deeper attitude of trust holds the power to drive out demons and to heal the sick. In the person of Jesus, Mark describes how the anxiety in the background of all human illness, possession, and missing oneself can be overcome through a faith within which humans can again first recognize God as their Father and can grow whole again by feeling that they have been newly gifted the right and permission to exist without having to earn it. The entire miracle cycle in the first part of the Gospel of Mark, and we will go into some of these miracles, must therefore be understood by means of psychoanalysis as this kind of concrete struggle of the Son of Humanity against the anxiety of humans in all its facets. In the encounter with the figure of Jesus, it is necessary to choose from a certain moment on between anxiety and faith, between despair and hope, between the sadistic perfectionism of boundless claims of being like God and the simple attitude of humanity that has become childlike. This means that the whole choice consists in accepting oneself as chosen by God. Every human being, if they do not sell themselves due to anxiety, to the destructive forces of this world, carries within themselves the inalienable image of God, which is imprinted far deeper in their soul than the distorted image of human violence in the form of the deified emperor could be stamped into the dead metal of Roman coins. To love this God, who from eternity has wanted that we exist with all the powers of our soul, so that through this our whole personality unites and comes together, is, in the words of Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, also according to Jesus, which is also according to Jesus, the only task of our life. So to love this God is, according to Jesus, also the only task of our life. Everything in us can become good only when we have escaped from the hell of our existence in the midst of anxiety. But, and here is again an objection, are the devilish spirits then not merely human spirits after all? Forces of the psyche, which were forced into the orcus, which is a term for underworld, of the unconscious due to anxiety. It is very important at first to answer this question unreservedly in the affirmative. So yes, at first we have to look at them as just as forces of the psyche. We have to look at the devil first just as a force of the psyche. Now, Drewermann doesn't stop there, but he says it's important that we start there and first just see it as such. Everything in the human soul is human, not devilish. It must therefore be understood in terms of the laws of the human psyche. Whenever a person encounters the devil, it makes sense psychoanalytically to see the figure of this personified evil as a memory after image of childhood experiences with one's own father, mother, or caregiver. The first hell into which we are thrust is created by people for other people. We experience this most intensively as long as we are dependent and helpless enough to view others as omnipotent, godlike figures on whose assistance and protection we absolutely rely. But the fear of other people soon becomes the fear of ourselves. Thus, it is not only the parental images that can take on the mask of the devil, it is above all our own shadow that appears to us as the devil. The devil is the cluster of all energies in our soul that we had to demonize in order not to lose the affection of those whom we believed to be gods. Finally, we will realize that we did and had to adapt not only to the expectations of our parents, but as much to the values, norms, and rules of behavior of our surrounding nature, society, and social class and group. We are the wearers of a mask that constitutes us as a person in the eyes of others, which consists of a whole assortment of various and contradictory roles into which we must slip in order to prove ourselves. As family men or women, as employees, bowling buddies, homeowners, party members, stamp collectors, or the devil knows what. Drewermann actually writes this, and I quote that. In the background of this exterior world of the persona is this existence as non-persons, alienated from our sense of I, our true ego. The term is Ich, which is a philosophical term. It is translated in Freud as ego, also in philosophy as well, but it really, Erik Erikson translated it as the sense of I, and I think that would be a good way of translating it, but sometimes in line with, depending on who Drewermann quotes or what he describes, I will say either I or ego. So to start this again, in the background of this exterior world of the persona, of this existence as non-persons alienated from our sense of I, lives what we must actually call the soul, our anima, or male our animus. And of course, Drewermann gets this term from Carl Gustav Jung. With enough external pressure from fear, we are soon led to a state in which our own soul confronts our consciousness like something devilish, or depending on the multitude of our eternal splits, like an entire army of foreign spirits. Anyone who has grasped the inner dialectic between the morality of the good will and the instrument of mental repression has lost once and for all faith in the doability of the good in humans. She or he will know that only a form of trust that calms anxiety can defeat the demonization of humans and integrate the world of, quote, spirits. After centuries of witch hunts and the demonization of the human psyche, it is indispensable to establish, with the help of depth psychology, a theology that no longer dissociates. So, is speaking of the devil in the end just something purely psychological? Specific only to a particular time? Although some exegetes today lean in a positivist fashion to this view, it is possible to recognize, with the help of daseinsanalysis and existential analysis combining with psychoanalysis, and beyond depth psychology, something true in the description of the New Testament, with the Gospel of Mark at the forefront, namely that human existence without God is objectively imprisoned by a world of the spirit or of certain spiritual attitudes that exists in itself and has taken on a life of its own. This first step in this direction is already taken when we grasp that we are thrown into situations of anxiety, not only from the outside biologically, psychologically, or sociologically, the structures of which we later internalize, but that anxiety is part of ourself and inseparably characterizes our destiny as spiritual beings. Depth psychology deals with the anxiety which the world brings. And, okay, let me say that again. Depth psychology deals with the anxiety which the world and other people bring to our consciousness. Daseinsanalysis, however, deals with the anxiety that belongs to being spirit. Only because of our consciousness, our spirit, our freedom, are we humans able to hear the snake of non-being speak and to perceive the infinite abyss above which all created existence lies. Now we have to understand what Drewermann means here with consciousness. With consciousness, he means explicitly our self-reflective consciousness. And there's actually a lot of research in philosophy, psychology, neurology, and so on the nature of our self-reflective consciousness. In one of the more recent books by Drewermann on neurology and the question of God, I'm going to show that to you briefly here. It's a 2-volume work again, Neurology and the Question of God. The first volume deals with research of the brain, and the second volume then deals with the question of whether we can maintain even the language about a soul and what a soul actually means. But in this, in one of the volumes, Drewermann looks at the neurological research on self-reflective consciousness, and he quotes Gerald Edelman, the Nobel Prize laureate, at length, who has shown that self-reflective consciousness neurologically consists in one map of neurons in our brain, basically mirroring other maps in our brain through reentrant feedback loops. And so it's we can sort of visualize this as two opposing mirrors. If you've ever been in an elevator where there are two mirrors opposite from each other, you will see more than one reflection of yourself. If it's not completely aligned, you will actually be able to see infinite, I mean, you can't really see it with your eye, but there would be infinite reflections. And so that's what self-consciousness does. Self-consciousness, or self-reflective consciousness, because again, self-consciousness is already something that has a connotation of sort of a guilty conscience or a shame-filled conscience. That's not what I mean here. Self-reflective consciousness is the structure that actually creates the condition for the possibility of us even thinking of infinity in the first place. And this is what it means to be a spirit in terms of daseinsanalysis, in terms of existential analysis, because it raises the anxieties that we have, the fear of death, for instance, to absolute levels, to infinite levels. Now, I do need to say a word here on the using the term anxiety. The German term that Drewermann typically uses is Angst, and the German term Angst is used very much in a way where you can use the term Angst, anxiety, as also being afraid of an object. So one can have a angst of snakes, whereas in English the word would be a fear of snakes. We can have an angst of death, anxiety of death, whereas in English we would say fear of death. Drewermann, I think, agrees, and actually he talks about this in other areas, but Drewermann, coming from Søren Kierkegaard, sees anxiety primarily as an existential anxiety. There is a nice little book that Paul Tillich wrote. Paul Tillich, the well-known theologian of the last century, The Courage to Be, where he talks about the distinction between fear and anxiety. And he makes clear in that book that while yes, fear is something that has a definite object, and anxiety typically does not, he makes clear that even when we have fear of an object, implicit and underlying is still also an anxiety of something that we're not knowing. For instance, we're afraid of the snake because it connects us to a possible death. And so anxiety shows up in fear. I typically will translate the word Angst with anxiety where I can, but sometimes, as I did just a moment ago, I will, when it's clear that there is a definite object, I will use the term fear. But let me continue here. Only because of our consciousness, I think I may have said that, but let me repeat this. And only because of our consciousness, our spirit, our freedom, are we humans able to hear the snake of non-being speak and to perceive the infinite abyss above which all created existence lies. So the snake, serpent actually it should be, the serpent of non-being becomes only a problem for us because we have the capacity to be infinitely afraid of non-being. In the background of all the anxiety-driven psychological repressions and defense mechanisms, which psychoanalysis describes, the meaning of this terror with which we wage war against ourselves appears to daseinsanalysis, that we want to destroy ourselves as spiritual beings and thus as conscious, free human beings, only with the purpose to feel less anxiety and to live a calmer existence. So the difference here is from a psychoanalytic or from a depth psychological perspective, we're trying to avoid certain specific fears. And sometimes we don't know what the fears are because it's unconscious. So we don't know how to avoid the situations. But daseinsanalytically or existentially, we're trying to avoid not just particular fears, but we're trying to get rid of the ability to experience fear. And so we want to destroy ourselves as spiritual beings, as self-reflective beings, as self-reflective consciousness, as free human beings. And so this is very significant because this is the reason why we will sacrifice our freedom in order to reduce our anxiety for a little bit. In the interest of time, I have to continue, but there are lots of other associations that Drewermann brings up here. One of them I just can mention, he doesn't talk about it in this introductory section, but the whole story in Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov is something that Drewermann connects this with as well. But let me finish the part here. The entire psychology of different character types developed by psychoanalysis in its theory of neurosis can be understood daseinsanalytically as the result of different forms of a forced one-sidedness of existence in the direction of a certain pole of human freedom at the expense of its complementary opposite pole. And this makes sense when we understand that for Kierkegaard, whom Drewermann is now quoting, for Kierkegaard, freedom is really living in the middle of the poles of infinity, and finitude or infinitude and finitude, and necessity and possibility. So when Drewermann talks about poles here, we can hang ourselves on the pole on infinity, or we can hang ourselves on the pole of possibility, or we can hang ourselves on the pole of necessity, or hang ourselves on the pole of finitude. And Drewermann associates these ways of hanging ourselves on one pole with the forms of despair. Of course, that's what Kierkegaard already contributes. But Drewermann says that the forms of character neurosis that psychoanalysis developed can be related to these forms of despair. And so I'll just mention this briefly here. So Kierkegaard writes in The Sickness Unto Death, in despair, not to will to be oneself, that's a quote from Kierkegaard, can mean to flee into the infinite in a depressive way, only to avoid the conflicts and limitations of earthly existence, meaning the finite. Or conversely, to flee into a purely schizoid way, to keep one's own ego clear of any inner decision by ever new variations of chameleon-like external conformity to the finite. It can mean, in a histrionic way, to move out of fear of reality into a dream castle of endless possibilities, or conversely, to transform the world in an obsessive compulsive way into a bundle of fictitious necessities. In all these forms, people try to escape their own freedom and responsibility. Everything we call character is also, among other things, an armor against the anxiety it costs to be human, a state of inertia, a lime deposit of fossilized forms of life that the sea creates when it retreats from the mainland as the polar ice caps grow older. In all of these forms of neurotic character structures, the will to be God becomes concretized. In schizoid character dynamics, the striving for self-sufficiency and independence. In depression, for omnipotence and omnipresence. In obsessive compulsion, for perfection and the necessity to be. And in histrionic character dynamics, for inexhaustible creativity and the wish to be everything. That is why everything depends on seeing behind what people do and what they do to each other, who they themselves are, and what kind of attitude is expressed in their behavior. Only then will one understand that there is really only one issue that decides whether people live in the realm of heaven or in the realm of hell. And he puts those terms in quotation marks. It is only a question of how we relate to the anxiety that characterizes us as spiritual beings, either as a distinction or as a curse, which decides on whether we either use our own efforts to calm the anxiety, because we cannot find a way back to the trust into the ground of our existence, or whether we find relief from the dynamic of anxiety by giving our fate back into the same hands that we may believe we owe our existence. The decisive question of our existence is how we can sleep during the storm on the sea, and with a word of trust, calm the wind of the waves, which is the story of the storming of the stilling of the storm in Mark 4. Now the last part, and I will finish with this, is a very important part here where Drewermann talks about the whole question of devil and God. But one may object once more at this point that such explanations at best make plausible that the anxiety that stems from the human spirit can take on demonic features, and that this does not portray the view of the Gospel of Mark, according to which instead certain spirits exist which drive humans into demonic forms of anxiety. The Gospel of Mark cannot indeed be understood by simply parroting its way of expression. So here is a connection to what Drewermann said earlier about when exegetes just repeat the concepts. Therefore, the step of psychological demythologization in the spirit of psychoanalysis and daseinsanalysis can at this point at first undoubtedly not be avoided. Because to understand how humans are characterized in their drivenness and lack of freedom in the Gospel of Mark, in order to understand that, it is crucial to interpret their distress and suffering, their trials and tribulations as consequences of fundamental mental and spiritual anxieties that determine them to the point of their personality structure. But if we humanize in this way the talk of evil spirits in order to finally not have to demonize anything in humans anymore, then the problem of anxiety gets completely shifted into the relationship between God and the human being. And then it is contrary to some Gnosticizing ideas of Carl Gustav Jung, at the same time, at least as important, to de-demonize also the image of God to such an extent that it can again appear trustworthy to humans. Yet this is precisely the meaning that talk of the devil can and must have in the Bible. Namely, it serves the purpose to remove all demonic traits from God. And then Drewermann talks about how things can really only go to the so-called demonic level because we infinitize the misery in ourselves, the anxieties in ourselves. But then the final part, and this is where the reference at the beginning to the Netflix show Lucifer comes in, comes this. But more dangerous than all of this is a form of the demonic which, in accordance with language in Christian dogmatics, only the pure spirits are capable of. And the Bible does not shy away from imagining what it would be like if even God were afflicted by such a mindset, meaning of a pure spirit. In Genesis 6, verse 5 and following, Yahwist, the writer, describes that God's self, and I will use God's self here for inclusive language for God. So in Genesis 6, 5 and following, Yahweh describes that God's self, seeing all the evil that humans commit, decided to cleanse the face of the earth, similar to an Augean stable from Greek writings, from human defilement through a great flood. So God decided to cleanse the face of the earth from human defilement through a great flood. But then God regrets it, and then God regrets the regret, and eventually decides never to curse humans in this way. Now that God does ultimately not reject us, but counts on us, this extremely anti-prophetic and anti-apocalyptic fundamental trait of the divine allows and makes it possible that we exist, despite all the seemingly hopeless misery of human life. And this is where Drewermann says John the Baptist and Jesus eventually fundamentally diverge. because John the Baptist, on some level, is this kind of apocalyptic prophet who calls us to repent and basically encourage us to use every effort of the will to purify ourselves. And Drewermann interprets in the commentary of the Gospel of Mark the story of Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist as Jesus kind of dying to this mentality of a pure spirit, of expecting from humans to be more than humans. And that Jesus found a compassion that goes beyond the rage that can also be part of the prophetic. But still, Drewermann says, there was and still is this monstrous thought which would perhaps be worthy of a God as such, and which God must apparently again and again reject, that the temptation for a perfection of creation, because the temptation for a perfection of creation would devastate all life. God, as the Bible tells us in the primordial history, resists this temptation once and for all. But if we thought of God's idea of an absolutely just and universal judgment, independent and separate from God, then we would indeed have the most perfect image of a Satan. And Satan is Hebrew originally for adversary, which would be a pure and supreme angel who becomes the devil in the effort to serve God better than God can be served. For an understanding of the misery of humans and their need for redemption in the Gospel of Mark, the following image of the devil is sufficient. When humans are afflicted by a way of thinking that forces them, with reference to God, to pose as more righteous and pure than even the Eternal One himself, God's self, then the highest ideas, the instructions of piety, as well as the rules of morality, become cruelly fanatical, terroristic, and unteachably rigid. And I want to say here, I believe this is the reason, because we in Christianity have turned the image of God into a demon and have demonized humans for such a long time. This is the reason why so many people today leave the fold of the church and become the nuns, because what they're doing is they're saying no more to this. We do not need the moralizing of being ever better than we really are. Nothing is in God is devilish, and nothing in humans must be devilish. Yet to what poor devils must people degenerate if out of anxiety they can no longer allow themselves to be human and instead hallucinate a God who at any time stands ready to impose a new great flood, and who first would try to force all people through previously uttered threats to be better than they can really be. Angels instead of people, and devils instead of angels. I close with this. What is clear is that people who are, as the Yahvistic primordial history characterizes them, and who are at the mercy of evil, as the Gospel of Mark describes it, cannot become open to themselves and to their own origin, other than by placing their trust into being loved and necessary just as they are in their limitedness. We will only stop feeling like we need to exist as children of darkness if we can gain the trust that in the very poverty of our birth, from dust, we belong to an invisible kingdom in which we are before God like guests and princes and princesses at the throne of eternity. This is the image of the human being with which Jesus wanted to free us from the power of evil. The Son of humanity should trust in God's vision of humans. Here concludes our lecture for today. Next week, we will go into the second part of this second section and talk about the whole notion of the redemption through the Son of God. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Sometimes some of the stuff may be somewhat dense, and it might be beneficial to review some parts of the video so that the distinctions can become really clear. But what is really novel about Drewermann is that he looks, with the help of psychoanalysis and with the help of existential daseinsanalysis, at what the language of life or death, of being evil or good, means existentially, and how it relates to our daily life, actually, our own struggle with despair or hope, with feeling limited and wishing to be sometimes who we are not, and our desire to really be ourselves. That is what the Gospel of Mark talks about. And this cannot be ignored or pushed aside because it deals with psychological and existential dimensions. If we do not deal with these dimensions, then stories like those in the Gospel of Mark are not humanly relevant. Drewermann argues that religion, properly understood, deals with the deepest question of humanity. It should not be moralized. And so that is the journey on which we will continue. Of course, I only read portions of this part of the introduction. That's what I can do. The translation, as you notice, sometimes is not yet fully polished. I am translating this as we go along, and so it is still in draft form. But I appreciate you being here, and I wish you a good week until next week. Thank you very much.